Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Graham Hurley.
Hi there. How are you doing today?
I'm fine. I'm just a little bored and a little cold. We've had fantastic weather for about a week, and now it's gone suddenly miserable.
See, ours is just starting to turn slightly more fantastic. Well, I'm hoping I can help with being bored on this episode. So can you tell me about your books?
Yes, it's quite a long story, and I'll try and condense it. I've always wanted to be a writer, ever since I can remember, so that makes me very little then. And like most writers, it took me a while to get published. And en route in that journey to getting published, I did various things, went off to university. I wrote endless mercifully unpublished novels. And then in the mid-'80s, in early middle age, I was working for a TV company. I was making documentaries. As it happened, we were in mid-Atlantic with an American crew trying to hunt for, locate, and make a film about the Titanic. And it took forever to find this ocean liner. And in the downtime on board the survey vessel, I struck up a relationship with the captain, who happened to be English, and he was crazy about reading and about books and about everything that world represented. And I shared with him my lifelong desire to become a published writer as opposed to an unpublished writer. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, we're not finding the liner, so off you go. Borrow the radio room tomorrow. I've got a typewriter. And I have to say, from that point on, I didn't look back.
That is incredible. So do you still like to write on typewriters, or was it just then that you preferred it?
No, I've been overwhelmed and overtaken, I'm afraid, by technology, and that makes me lazy. I know. I still got my all-time favorite typewriter. But these days I do it on screen, which is much, much easier. And of course, the internet is an incredible asset for people in my business. Definitely. But in those early days, it was a typewriter. When it came to the editing, it was lots of scissors, lots of sellotape, lots of messing around. It took an age, but every next chapter I wrote in every next book confirmed to me, and I think writing is a virus. I think it gets inside your blood. I think it's a sort of COVID thing, but benign.
Oh, yeah.
And I've never looked back, as I say. I absolutely adore it. And since that point, I stayed in television for another 3-4 years. And then my wife and I took a giant gamble, and we stepped out of television, stepped out of the regular paycheck. And since then, I've been writing one published book a year. And to date, that makes me a much published author.
Wow, that's really incredible. So you mentioned that you created documentaries. Has that impacted the way that you write?
Yes, I think it has. I've got a very visual imagination, which is a great help when it comes. I think it was partly formed by making films. But when you're in the business of making films, and my speciality was documentary, and I made quite a number of those, more than 100, and that forces a certain kind of narrative logic on you. So you start compressing stories, and you're always looking for that visual cue. And I'm very aware that when I approach a new scene, which I've done a lot this year because there's nothing else to do but write, thanks to lockdown, I adopt exactly the same approach. You can only go on what your friends and what readers say when they come back to you, but I think it works. It certainly helps the narrative pace. It helps to be able to imagine places, often places I visited, often places that have a sort of favoured shelf in my imagination. And I raid that larder of locations. And the visual is always the information that dominates the opening paragraphs.
Yeah, definitely. So you write a lot of historical fiction, and as you just mentioned, you can tend to go back to places that you visited before. And how do you balance writing history and fiction and not making it too one way or the other?
Very good question. This is going to be a longish answer. When you go into publishing, as you obviously know, there are a series of what we in this country call genre boxes that are available to you. Mm-hmm. And your success or otherwise often depends upon the choice of genre box. So, for example, you can be sex and shopping or historical romance or I don't know, fantasy fiction. And to my great excitement, when I began writing, I had a 2-book contract on the back of a TV series I invented and wrote. And the label on the outside of the genre box was International Thriller Writer. And that was immensely exciting. And I did 7 of those. And they were contemporary. They were big, fat airport novels. After that, I went into crime fiction at the invitation of my new publisher. I've been poached by a different house. And my wife and I had the immense good fortune of living in a South Coast city beside the water called Portsmouth. And Portsmouth is a naval city. And Portsmouth, if you ever, Molly, get into the business of writing crime fiction, it's every crime novelist's best friend.
Oh.
It's situated on an island. There are lots of people there. It once had the label of being the most densely populated city in Europe. It's very claustrophobic. It's very distinctive. It's pretty rough. But there are, believe me, stories at every street corner.
Oh,
and I was initially, to begin with, I was a bit wary about this step into crime fiction because I didn't read crime fiction. I didn't much like crime fiction. But I had to keep the fridge at least half full. So that's that. You know, I didn't have a choice. And so I set about it as one does. And because I had by then a long history of making documentaries, I was well used to the business of research. Because documentaries live or fall, succeed or fail by your choice of subject. And that means getting alongside individuals, people, getting inside their heads, clambering into their hearts, trying to work out what it is to be them. That's what a novelist does, of course.
Yeah.
And so I was presented with this big challenge of how do I become a successful writer in a genre I don't much like? And so I decided to take the documentary route and somehow become a detective. By this time, I had lots of contacts in the city. I had a column in the local paper. I had many good friends and lots of favours to call in. And that was the route I took. And I spent 3 months working alongside working detectives in this city, Portsmouth. And it was by far and away the hardest research challenge I'd ever encountered. Because detectives in this country, and I'm sure yours, probably more in yours, if I'm to believe the detectives I see on screen, are what they say it says on the tin. You know, they're suspicious by nature. They don't talk to strangers willingly. In my experience, the guys I was trying to get alongside had a personal list of hate figures, and at the bottom was their local line manager who signed their overtime forms, and then they were up to local councillors and civil servants at the Home Office and national politicians. And at the very top, there were people like me, media people who had no place in their world, people who wanted to ask the impertinent questions. But I stayed the course, I watched and I listened, and of course I found out that being a detective isn't at all what you'd think it is. And I ended up writing a dozen novels in what I call the minor key. And that's the key in which most working detectives exist. So this isn't the world of fast car chases and serial killers. It's the world of almost incessant frustration. And as I watched and as I listened, that world began to shape itself in front of me. And because the access in terms of procedures and the small print of their own frustrations began to impact on me, I thought, well, I suspect I've got access here to something quite rare in terms of writerly access. And to my astonishment, and I have to say delight, the series went really, really well, particularly in France, of all places, because the French loved it. They loved the slightly left-wing. I'm a socialist. I know it's a dirty word maybe in Chicago. I don't know.
I don't think I think it's fine.
Okay.
I don't know what other people think, but
right.
I think it's fine.
Yeah, okay. And so the French bought the film rights, and they began to make feature film adaptations for French TV, which were very successful, and they got them into the top 5 in France. And at that point, I thought, well, this isn't bad, but 12 is enough. And then I did another 4 because we moved and we went down to the West Country where we now live, which is very pretty. It's everything that Portsmouth isn't. It's not crowded. It's not aggressive. It's not hostile. You don't get bricks through your window.
Oh.
It's a delightful place to live, but it's an even harder challenge to convert peace of mind into page-turning drama. And after a while, after 16 now crime novels, I thought, well, what I'd really love to do is to get back to my first love, and my first love has always been the Second World War. To answer your question, and I'd made a number of anniversary documentaries about D-Day, about Dunkirk, about Dieppe, about all those famous British defeats during the Second World War, and how much we owe to you guys. And one of the sad truths about publishing is if you have any kind of success, publishers are very, very, very keen to keep you in your genre box. How dare you try and construct the tunnel that's going to take you under the wire and escape from the gulag that is crime fiction. But I thought, no, I think I've had enough. If I write another police interrogation sequence, I will go bonkers. And so my wife and I do lots of traveling. We got a beaten up old van. It was October. We were in an area called Galicia, which is northwest Spain. And we came across a little tiny harbour called Obaquero, and it was a sunny afternoon, and there was a plaque in the harbour wall, and it recorded the loss of the sinking of a U-boat in 1944. And 9 of the crew were lost. The rest were saved by local fishermen. And that became, over the next, week, 10 days, the germ for a book that I called Finisterre. And it was written out of commission. It was a complete punt. It was, again, a big book, an airport book, big, thick book, holiday book. Sent it to my agent. He said, this isn't crime fiction. What are you doing? And I said, well, I just fancy, I've got the spade, I've got the tunnel. I'm halfway out of the gulag. Please, I want to write something different. And thank God he found a publisher in the shape of a firm called Head of Zeus, which is run by a lovely man called Nick. And he turned out to be a fellow World War II buff. And we bonded over lunch, as writers tend to, and publishers sometimes. Mm-hmm. And that's become the lead title for a series called The Spoils of War. And Last Flight to Stalingrad is number 5 in that series. And from the moment I began that first uncommissioned book, I just knew I was onto something. There was a coming together of history, of reading, of real characters, people who played often hugely important roles in the war, and of people I'd invented. And the challenge of trying to keep that marriage in order, that fusion of fact and fiction, has stayed with me and deepened, I have to say, since that point. So I thank God for Obaquero. It's a sad fact that the 8 men died, but it's been a wild journey. I've loved it.
Yeah. Wow. I'm in shock with that answer. That was so beautiful. So your book, I'm currently reading it, by the way, Last Flight to Stalingrad, and it is incredible.
What do you make of it?
Oh, incredible. I was up all night reading it. But it's told from the perspective of the, well, obviously you know this, but this is more for the audience. It's told from the perspective of one of the heads of propaganda for the Nazis. How did you really put pen to paper on that? Because it's a really heavy subject and something that I would imagine would be hard to write from.
Well, my sort of decision to draw a bead, if I can put it that way, on Goebbels was conditioned by two things. In the first place, I'd worked the same trick, if I can use that phrase, in earlier books in terms of Ribbentrop, in terms of Hitler, in terms of Churchill, and in terms of some of the slightly lesser known figures that bestrode the stage between 1939 and 1945. So I knew I could make it work. The more I read over the previous four books about Goebbels, the more I realized the power of, and this is his phrase and not mine, the big lie. The more I watched Donald Trump, and I've, as so many of my mates here in the UK have watched a great deal of Donald Trump. And here's a confession, Molly. Life is definitely duller without Donald Trump. I'm really glad he's gone. I think he's a terrible, terrible man.
Yes.
But he brightened every day because he was so beyond.
He did
content.
not brighten days here. No.
So I drew the bead on Goebbels, and I was fascinated by Goebbels, and it's a truth that I've stumbled across that it's often the case with great men, that men that find their place in history, that they're deep down very lonely. And that was certainly true of Goebbels. Goebbels was a clever man. Goebbels was a driven man. Goebbels had a very complicated love life. Goebbels was in love himself with Hitler. And I thought, well, how would I use, if I can employ that word, how can I use usefully Goebbels within that huge and disturbing canvas, which is one of the most ghastly battles ever fought. Battle of Stalingrad. Mm-hmm. And to make that work, I had to invent someone unreal, someone who came out of my imagination, to partner up, as it were, with Goebbels. And that someone was a Georgian who I suspect you will have met by now on the page. Mm-hmm. And his real name is Mikhail Magalashvili. He comes from a mountainside town called Svengati in the Caucasus. He's an imp of a man. He's slightly weightless. He's a dancer. He's fearless, takes huge risks, and has reinvented himself as Werner Neumann. And I hope credibly, he becomes of enormous use to Goebbels because he can put his own twist, his own take on any event and any bunch of people. Now, because he's restless and reckless, he gets into terrible trouble with Goebbels. Goebbels gives him a mission to go to Italy via Venice and then Rome to deliver a letter to an old mistress. And he does that and he takes advantage, which is absolutely in his character. Goebbels doesn't understand the word forgiveness, but he does understand the word revenge. And he thus hands Neumann the ultimate challenge and probably his last assignment. And that challenge is to go to Stalingrad in the autumn of 1942 and somehow put lipstick on the pig that is the developing battle. And that's what Neumann has to do. Mm-hmm. And that's where the book came from. And here's an interesting thing, Molly. I had the book very loosely planned in my head, which is the way I tend to do it. And the minute that Neumann walks into the narrative, which is on page 1, as you'll know, I just knew this book would work. And it will be up to you, obviously, and anyone else.
Oh, it definitely does. It definitely does work.
Right. Well, I think it was a bold coupling to bring the two together in two ways. One, I've got to make Neumann, with his quite complicated background, this imp of a man, this force of nature. I've got to make him real, I've got to make him credible, and I've got to make him sympathetic. That's number one. And number two, I've got to bring alive, I've got to make Goebbels himself live on the page so that you cease to think, well, this man, is a historical figure and doesn't deserve a private life of his own. Well, he does. And I've given him one, which is based on fact. And thus, as I say, trying to arrange this ambitious marriage, I have to say, of fact and fiction, which is really the story of all these books in that same series, The Spoils of War, has been absolutely entrancing.
Yeah. So, well, what you were saying too about how they call it like the big lie and everything. Throughout the book, he keeps saying like, "Oh, all I do is lie. That's my job. I'm a liar for the Nazis." And it's like, oh wow, and it's a really heavy book, like, to read, to realize that you're feeling sympathetic for these people who are doing such awful things. But that's what makes it interesting, and it makes it so that way you can kind of like cross-examine yourself while you're reading it.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually, because what you put your finger on there, Molly, is the fact that we look back, do we not? I do it all the time. And I have the reach and the time to interrogate, to try and get to know, in this case, a passage of history, a 6-year passage of history. And I'm trying all the time to imagine living through that at a number of levels, at the level of my mum and dad who lived through it, and at the level of people like Goebbels and Churchill and so forth, and Roosevelt. I try and apply that same logic to now, and without question, we are living through a deeply historical passage. Mm-hmm. Certainly here
Definitely.
in England, we're up against two things. One is COVID, and you will have the same problem, the same issue, the same challenge. And the second, and you don't have this, and you're better off without it, believe me, but we're trying to tussle with something even more fearsome in some respects, which is Brexit, which is backing out of Europe on the worst possible terms. And I know that in 4 or 5 years' time, I'm going to be sitting down with our grandchildren, who by that time will be in their mid-teens, and trying to explain to them what it's like to have lived through that passage of history. They're doing it themselves, but, because they're only kids, they don't really understand. Well, we understand, and we understand by watching television and reading the papers and so forth. But does it really feel historic? Well, as a sort of historian and working journalist and working novelist, yes, it does. But I look out of the window and it's the same view. I go to our local supermarket and it's broadly the same stuff on the shelves. So what's actually changed? I'm not like my mum living under the bombs in London in 1940, 41, 42. I'm not like my dad out in North Africa flying a Beaufighter, night fighter, hunting for Italian submarines. But nonetheless, what happens this year and what's happened to us last year is going to shape our lives and the lives of our kids and our grandkids forever. So Getting a handle on that, particularly as a working novelist, is fascinating.
Yeah, and like it's the unimaginable continues to happen this year for like where I am, for where you are, everywhere, for the whole world. But then it just life keeps going on, and people are still writing books and still like preserving time capsules from this era.
You're absolutely right. I happen to be, I'm doing 2 series at the moment. One is the series that has spawned Last Flight to Stalingrad, which is the World War II series. And I'm also writing a series of contemporary thrillers seen through the eyes of a 42-year-old Anglo-Breton actress called Enora Andresen. And I write these to keep my sanity. You can't live in the past all the time. And I alternate between World War II and now. And I've just finished a book called Intermission. All these books, and there are now nearly 6 of them, have sort of thespian titles. So it's Curtain Call, it's Off Script, and in this case it's Intermission. And it's about how COVID has stolen into all our lives, and in this case has stolen someone very dear to her. And that, again, makes me, as a novelist, very privileged to the degree that in this one small example, I can bring whatever talents I may or may not have to try and nail down what it's like to be Enora Andresen, what it was like to be the friend that she's lost, and where all that will take us. Now, when I say that we're living, at the moment through a deeply historical, this is really is a bend in the road. It's not simply because of COVID. And there are, as I've already described, there are things in this country that are deeply, deeply troubling. Mm-hmm. But you've got it's a great time of my life to be able to look back and think, well, I think I might be just a little wiser about what it must have been like in 1945, which is the year before I was born, and what it was like to be my mum and dad. And that's a privilege, believe me.
Yeah. So what was the research process like for for all of your books, essentially, like for the historical fiction novels that you've written?
Well, I've been a voracious reader all my life. I mean, we didn't have a telly in our house in Clacton-on-Sea, which you will never have heard of until very late in the day. So I was 16 or 17 years old before I had a TV. And that actually was a blessing, because I read and I read and I read and I read, and I've never lost the habit. And that's why I became a writer, I think. And writing historical novels, my launch point, and I'm now out of, as of yesterday, I finally put to bed not the next book after Last Flight to Stalingrad, but the book after that.
So congratulations.
Thank you very much. Yes, we're going to raise a glass or two. We'll raise a glass to you this evening, Molly. And I always start the same way, and that is by, first of all, having just the vaguest. I have a vague idea as we speak that I want the next book, and these books are written out of sequence, and that was the deal that I and the publisher, Nick, came to in our first meeting. I didn't want to be bound to one central character, and I didn't want to be bound to an ongoing chronology, sort of step by step with the one character through the next six years. I didn't want that. I wanted the freedom, the creative freedom, to be able to dot about and to bring characters forward. So they play, a biggish role in book 4, and then they'd retire and take a deep breath for book 5, and someone you'd met in book 2 suddenly has a huge role in book 6, and so forth. And that's worked really, really well. I have to keep tabs with the characters as they go on, but that's interesting. And so I've got this sort of vague idea, and it's going to take place in the Paris of 1940. So it's very early on in the war. The French are traumatized. They've had a terrible decade. They've rolled over in front of the Germans. It's been an absolute disaster and debacle, and that's the setting. And so I set to, and I'm just looking over my shoulder here, and my table is already groaning under the weight of books I have to consume over the weeks to come. And I gradually get to a point where I feel in familiar territory. And then gradually, day by day, thought by thought, night by night, the plot will begin to shape itself. And that's the way it happens. And it's a magical process, and it's always happened that way, actually. And until I get towards the end of a book, and this book I've just finished was a perfect example. I was, 75 pages out, and I had no idea how it would end. Not the first. Absolutely nothing there. And then, the trick is never lose your nerve. Why do I say that? Because Werner Neyman never loses his nerve. So take a leaf out of one of your characters' books. And in the end, it all came good. And I hope better than good. So that sense of adventure, that sense of revelation, that sense of taking myself by surprise, which probably sounds a bit daft, but believe me, it works.
Oh, yeah, no, that's happened to me. Pretty much all the authors on this show, they're always like, it completely takes me by surprise when they're writing. So, yeah. Well, this has been so incredible to talk to you, and I just have one final question, and that is, what do you have coming up?
Well, this evening, as I say, we're going to raise a glass to you, and I think I'm looking at a bespectacled man with a beard. That must be your husband.
Oh.
Is that right?
No, that's my dad.
Oh,
I'm 13.
Your dad. Right. Oh, okay. Well, my compliments to your dad. He takes a fine picture.
Okay.
So we'll raise a glass to him as well. I hope that I get a new contract. I think I probably will, but this is not the time to make any kind of easy assumptions about life, and one never should. I'd be lost without writing, as my wife often tells me. I look forward to the next adventure. The next book will be in Paris. The book after that has the title Schweiger Musik, and will be set in 1943 in the world of the Night Fighters. So there's nothing not to love, I have to say, Molly, about coming up.
Yeah, I cannot wait to read all the new stuff coming out. I highly recommend your book, The Last Flight to Stalingrad, to anyone listening to this. Once again, it was so great to talk to you today.
It's been a pleasure, Molly.
For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
And mine is Graham Hurley, and it was a great pleasure.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after.
We hope so.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. This episode is hosted by Molly Southgate. It is edited by Rob Southgate and produced by Southgate Media Group. You can get in touch with the show at readbetweenthelines@gmail.com, or you can send us a voicemail at 708-887-9473. That was 708-887-9473. You can also find us on Instagram at Read Between the Lines Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.